welcome back to the Brando and Joe podcast. I'm excited to introduce our guest today, Dr. Seymour Adler. He received his PhD in psychology from NYU and currently works as a consultant at Spencer Stuart. Welcome, Seymour. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, no, we're excited. I mean, we were talking about it before the episode started. Brandon and I got to hear you speak at PsyOp about when you talked about being working as a consultant while also teaching, and that got us really excited to have you on because I bet that's a busy life in itself. You're probably doing a lot all the time.
Well, it is a busy life, but I think, when I look at my career as an psychologist and I look at people strongly identified with the field, I really feel like I've got it all, in the sense that I have the opportunity to teach at the doctoral level. I have the opportunity to consult at very senior levels of organizations. I have colleagues who also are IOs, and therefore we speak a common language. We think in similar ways. We diagnose problems and think through solutions in similar ways, and really smart colleagues who I can rely on, not only for being creative and innovative and inventive, but for doing very hard work and operating in a totally collaborative way. Uh, and I still have passion for the field. I've been doing this for almost 50 years. I still really have passion for our field. Um, I love reading the literature. I love being exposed to new and creative ideas. And I very much continue to love helping clients, which is really the focus of almost every great practitioner I know.
It's so great hearing that experience too, though. Like one thing that I picked out when you were talking at PsyOp about being a practitioner while also being a professor was you kind of had the ability for your students to keep you on your game. I remember you saying that. And I thought that that was such an interesting point because as a consultant, you're always going to be a subject matter expert with all of your clients, and then your students are going to be keeping you on your toes. Was that something that you saw as like almost something that helped you out in the process?
There's really three aspects to it if I look back over my career. Aspect number one was my NYU training was real academic training. We were all expected to go into academia, and most of us did, at least in my cohort and around the several cohorts around me. But interestingly, two of our major professors were folks who were psychologists in their early years, but who worked in industry before they went back to academia, which also was sort of a role model thing. They were practitioners, and then they decided, no, I really want to invest my in an academic career. I want to publish. I want to do research. So they were role models in a very different sense that you could go back and forth, and especially go back from being practitioners to being academics. Uh, in those days, by the way, if you go back and others have analyzed this trend in IO, the in the early days before I went to graduate school, but in the era that my professors were entering the field in the 50s and 60s, go back and look at the authors for the Journal of Applied Psychology or Personnel Psychology, and it was a very strong percentage of practitioners who did research, publishable scientific research. Maybe a quarter or a third of the authors were not academic. Uh, but nonetheless, because of their commitment to the science, and the science was pretty new, they were publishing. You guys might not know this, but back in the 50s and 60s, organizations like IBM, AT&T, and many others had large what they called then personnel research groups, where they did publishable empirical research, often even experimental research that was of the top academic quality. So that I sort of had that role model for me by my professors. This business of sort of doing both and maintaining a connection to the science. The other thing was when I got into consulting, first part time because I was a full time academic, and then more full time. I looked at the people we were competing with in our organization, we as IOs and IO kinds of practices. And there were really smart people at Boston Consulting Group, at McKinsey, and at other organizations like that. They were smart, they were articulate, they were analytical. So, even then in my consulting roles, I said, how do I compete with these guys? What's the differentiator? You know, I think they're smarter than me. I think they have a better command of the language. I think they are have stronger analytic skills, just in terms. I don't mean in terms of statistical analysis, but just in terms of getting to the heart of the problem and coming up with a creative solution. So what do I have to compete with them? And I suddenly realized that what I have is science. They're smart. They come up with great ideas. They're creative. They've got a great perspective on a complex business related situation out as a consultant. But I have JAP, I have personnel psych, I have OBHDP, I have academic roots, really uh, gives me a, a basis, a foundation that I can rely on. And part of the way through my career, we had Schmidt and Hunter come along, and others behind them, Tim Judge and others who uh, created and applied and exploited meta-analysis and validity generalization. And now I had not only a tool in science, but a tool that could be boiled down to really foundational, trustworthy, reliable insights and findings, not just based on one random study, but based on a series of studies subjected to rigorous statistical techniques to come up with, does this trend really exist or doesn't exist? Are these relationships really replicable or are they not replicable? And so, in a certain sense, the science got better. Science relied less on one off studies and more on meta analytic studies. And I found both in teaching and in my practice that is what most informed what I was willing to stand up in front of a senior executive audience and say, you know, this is this is the truth. I mean, maybe I overstated it, but this is a conclusion, a recommendation, and I have not just one but four legs to stand on, because there were 32 studies, and Schmidt and Hunter or Denise Owens or Tim Judge did this analysis between leader transactional orientation and performance, or characteristics of a team and performance, or the relationship between personality and the emergence of a leader. You name it. You had these, growing science. Excuse me. So part of it was the modeling, part of it was the differentiation from much smarter consultants that are out there that I was competing with, and the third was a certain increased confidence in our science to feed what I was doing as a practitioner.
It's a great sentiment because I agree. When as IO psychologists, you bring that scientific mind when you mix with the data skills that not everybody has, whether you're in consulting or they're working another internal job. And we talk a lot about that on this podcast because when people ask like what do you do in IO psychology and like what kind of skills can you actually bring, you talk about like your research methods, you talk about like your science backed knowledge, but then like, oh, I can also work with the data, and it's the great mix of it too. I wanted to ask, when you do your consulting work and when you work with the clients, have you found the best way to communicate this this academic science knowledge? We frequently talk about the scientist practitioner gap. Uh, is this like, is there like certain skills that you think you picked up on like how to communicate these behaviors or solutions?
Well, certainly you shouldn't be using jargon. Jargon makes other people feel excluded, like you're in some secret society with your own language. So it's all the things you know about. It's storytelling. It's bringing it to life, um, but basing it on the science. And by the way, it's a double edged sword. So this year at SIOP, my very esteemed and beloved colleagues, Miriam Nelson and Amy Grubb, and I did yet another storytelling session at SIOP to help folks bridge that science practitioner gap. Were either of you at the session?
We were at the Metro one that I
Yeah.
know you did a brief
Okay.
one, but I didn't see the PSYOP one.
Yeah, the year before, but this year was a little different. This year, as you may know, in our science, Paul Sackett and his colleagues had a number of papers that I wouldn't say overturned, but certainly strongly qualified a finding from science that I have been preaching to organizations for the last 25 years, ever since it emerged so strongly in the literature through Schmidt and Hunter and others, and that is the extraordinary power of general mental ability to predict performance in all levels, all jobs, in all circumstances. I myself have said more than dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times over these last 25 years, if you only had a candidate for 15 minutes for a job, any job, the best way to use that 15 minutes is to get an estimate of their IQ, their general mental ability. I've said that because that's what the science taught me. And Sackett and his colleagues in 2022, 2023, and now in 2024 again have published a whole series of studies that overturned that assumption. That's the beauty of science. It's self correcting. For example, in their most recent 2024 study, they examined all the research on the relationship between general mental ability and performance before 2000 and after 2000. Why is that important? Not because of the I2K crisis or some millennial event that affected the cosmos, but because we've moved to being a knowledge society and a knowledge culture and knowledge workers. And so uh, they wanted to see whether or not the studies done, and not faulting the methodology of those studies, they made corrections to those methodologies, which gave rise to the 22 and 23 papers. But now they looked at it and they said, uh, work has changed. We talk about new ways of working and the evolution of ways of working. Is Has that had an impact on the degree to which cognitive ability, general cognitive ability versus other factors, impact on how effectively people perform, how quickly they learn their jobs? And they found a significant difference. So the session on telling the story at PSYOP this year was different. It is looking at the double-edged sword of relying on science as a self-correcting, evolving body of work, and saying, how do you go back to your boss? You've been in this job, in a talent acquisition job, for 10 years. You have fed them a line that they then implemented in selection practices, and knocking on the door and saying, I've been reading the journals. It's not exactly like that. It's still, cognitive ability is important, but I definitely think we're over rotating on that in our talent acquisition processes, and maybe we should pull back. You have to that so that takes not just good storytelling, but courage to be so committed to bringing to your clients or your boss, to the organizations you serve, the best knowledge you can bring them at this very moment, and having the courage to have those conversations, even when the guy looks at you and says, wait a minute, you've been giving me this line ever since you were hired 15 years ago. What suddenly happened? And having the courage to give the best advice we can, even if it sort of undermines, it shouldn't undermine your credibility, but to some extent it does. It makes your definitiveness in question. Um, How definitive you are now based on the work of Sackett? Well, I'm definitive for 2024. What will happen in 2027? That's what science is all about.
Right. No, that's a really great point to make. And I think when you're like in a master's program or a PhD program, it teaches you to have that mentality. I want to pick off of what you said there about communicating to your boss or to a client, especially if, let's say, trends change. Like, what would you recommend for like people who are early on in their careers trying to push maybe like an IO topic, it like in a selection practice, or maybe in like a, or like how you're speaking to talent acquisition, when guest management or the client might not be fully on board with like following all of the normal practices that we would say would make something very valid and reliable. Like, what would be a recommendation that you would have for someone in that type of scenario?
A great question. And I can do things all these decades into my career that somebody new in their career can't do. Um, but making a strong case that makes sense to somebody in business, that talks about impact, uh, not necessarily on the bottom line or share price, but maybe something two or three steps be, before that, that a very smart leader would say, "Oh yeah, but if we, for example, enhance, if you can show me that this enhances engagement, well, I know that people who are more engaged are less likely to leave. They're more likely to give discretionary effort. You can even provide evidence of that." And then you don't necessarily have to fill in all the causal links to share price. I actually, people do that. Uh, and IOs coming out of school think they have to do it. Well, my feeling is they don't have to do that. That's ridiculous. Share prices are determined on such a macro level by so many factors, to think that the little tweak you're doing to talent practice in your organization is ultimately going to cause a 30% rise in your share price to make everybody with stock options rich is, I think, naive, and overstepping. So back to what newcomers should be doing. They should be building trust in their professional expertise. And sometimes that trust requires, stating things, maybe a tad more definitively, because people want to know that you're definitive about things that have some level of uncertainty. By the way, that's true of all leaders. You didn't ask me that question, but one of the things I talk about to leaders is that, we live in such an uncertain world. But on the other hand, you can't be communicating a message that says, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe we should do that. If we do that, maybe we'll fail. Leaders need to provide clear, definitive, and assured direction with a real tone of assurance, and, but also to recognize that there's guardrails and there's risk, and you're always going to be looking out for maybe you're wrong. And the same thing when you're starting your profession as an IO. You need a degree of confidence when you're giving a recommendation. Young IOs often, maybe even older IOs often, uh, go too much around, well, these people found this and these people found this, and we're not exactly sure, but this is what I think is right, and it might be right. And, so too qualified to really get somebody to trust you and act on your recommendation. And it needs a degree of assurance and confidence, but an assurance and confidence that's built on your thinking through what's the business case, what's the evidence, uh, and that way building your own credibility as a reliable professional who's really going to help here.
The confidence piece is interesting because I know as young IOs in a field that I feel like is still growing, we wonder how we can like proclaim it as like what we're doing is important, and also what we can offer is valid for someone that might not really totally understand what IO is. But I like that piece about confidence because it is true, um, and I wanted to kind of shift it, but keep some of those themes when we talk about your professor life. Are these themes that you try to instill in your students, and is this like some stuff that you try to portray in your classes, whether it's like these consulting skills and like how to deliver these messages? But I guess it also depends on what classes you teach too.
So I want to answer that question, but I do want to go back to put a point on what I said right before. And I meant it when I said about overreaching. You don't, as a young professional, there is this tendency to say, and if you do this, there's evidence that you're going to increase share price. You know, don't don't feel the pressure to do that. Don't feel the pressure to go too far out on the limb in your promises, so that at the end you'll just undercut trust. I've always felt that smart leaders use young professionals very effectively. They don't have to be convinced that development programs, training programs are important as work changes, as the ways of working change, as the ways of leading change. They know that, so that your ability to create a logical connection between, our science says if we do this, we're going to impact on something that I actually can measure: engagement, turnover, um, a number of creative, innovative ideas or patents received or whatever. But something that is proximal. Don't, you know, young professionals do have this, feel they have a pressure to overpromise. Don't. It really risks the trust that you're going to be building. So back to your question, I teach only one doctoral seminar course a year, and it's an omnibus course. In other words, I cover from selection to culture and leadership and organizational socialization and teams and personality and performance management, all those topics. Um, I again, as I've been describing my approach, it's a mix of reading the current literature. One of the things I really work hard on. Uh, yeah, people laugh when I say this. I sometimes use about half of my Christmas vacation preparing for my spring semester by reviewing the journals. And one of the things I really uh, try to accomplish, and in most cases I do, is if you looked at my syllabus for spring of 2024, you will see that about 70 or 80% of it are references, journal articles from 22, 23. I really, it's important for me, for the reasons I said earlier, to have them up to date. But in class, we don't uh, we don't cover those articles the way they might be covered in other doctoral programs, where we're cutting into, did this guy use the right eigenvalues? Did they use the right rotations for factor analysis? Uh, you know, uh, did the controls used in an experimental study really? Did they do a good manipulation check to make sure that the experimental manipulation worked? Shouldn't they have done this? Shouldn't they have done that? Uh, that's not, doctoral students, graduate students get a lot of that. You got to read the journal articles really carefully, uh, and understand where they're strong and where they're weak. And that's an emphasis in a lot of doctoral courses, not in mine. Mine is sort of probably not surprising based on what I told you already. A disproportionate number of those articles from the major journals are meta-analyses. Uh, Again, I want them to see the value of meta-analyses, but there's also a very strong practitioner focus. Uh, the probably the hour or two that my doctoral students most dread and most appreciate and most get the most of is right in the early in the semester. I divide them up into consulting teams. I give them all an actual request for proposal that I've gotten in the prior year or two from a client. I obviously disguise the client's name, and I say, 4 weeks from now, your 2 or 3 teams are going to be presenting to the client. And nowadays, the client in RFP processes is not a person ever. It's four, five, six people, and I get all of my buddies uh, to be part of that. Of that, uh, I don't let them. I don't let them watch a prior presentation that day. They can watch one after they've presented, but I want to give every team a fair chance. I give them billing rates, and they have to prepare and they present. Like I said, I think that's probably what they most dread, but almost universally they get a lot out of. So you asked about how I infuse practitioner skill sets in the course. That's a major way. And after they're done, uh, my panel, my my panelists are really esteemed and beloved colleagues, some of whom I've worked with for 30 years. One of whom is on the Hofstra Advisory Committee, Brian Ruggerberg.
Ah, we love that
Um,
Past
guy.
guest.
yeah, I love that guy too. He is better. We've been working together for 27 years, the two of us. But I always feel like they are kinder. I think my students will say that too. They're kinder. I go last in providing feedback and critiquing. And in fact, sometimes I wait till my buddies are all off the phone or off the screen. I don't want them to hear, after they've heard all these wonderful things. Oh, it was so great. It was wonderful. You might want to work on this, or you might have tried this a little differently. But and by the critiques and the feedback are not only about the technical solution that they're proposing. How well did they hand off to each other? Did they read the slides or did they tell the story? Uh, how animated? So it's that whole, you talked about the skill set of communication, that's factored in. It's not just about the solution. And we laugh afterwards, and we tell them we laugh afterwards because the naivete around pricing projects, we have had consulting groups of students come in and present like an elaborate 6 month piece of study and the development of multiple modules for training and development and how much it'll cost? I don't know, $35,000. With six people working for 6 months, and a page long list of deliverables. So that's the most minor part of it, but uh, there is this notion of underestimating the labor required to do some of this work. But and then the last piece I'll mention is what I'm doing right now, which is in every class I uh, totally open up the floor to literally any question that any student wants to ask about my career, things that I've encountered, mistakes that I've made. How do I do this? How do I manage that? Um, and you heard a little bit maybe of that at PsyOp. Uh, I don't know. There was one of my students in the doctoral seminar said that a professor at Hofstra uh, told her to ask me, so how do I keep up with the journals and do all my consulting, and thank goodness have a rich family life with children and grandchildren all around and all of that. But I managed to do it and still get a night's sleep pretty much most nights.
It's really cool to hear that story. I know Joe and I have had similar stories in the past of all the fake consulting companies we've built in our time at the Hofstra program. I I know that like you spoke about this where you're saying like you build this environment of like showing the practitioner side, showing the research side. And I love like that you were mentioning that you're critiquing them on things that are not just necessarily like IO knowledge based, but it's like how are you going to build a good pitch or something along those lines, because that's something that you might not get out of a textbook, and that's something you really can only get from experience. And it's really cool that you're building things like that into the coursework that you have. For the sake of time, Dr. Adler, one thing we want to make sure we ask you, that we ask all of our guests, uh, we we've gotten a lot of great advice from you and just a lot of really awesome stories and input, but if you could give one piece of advice for prospective IO students or early career IOs, what would that one piece of advice be?
Well, maybe I'll share the advice I gave myself or lived anyway. Um, when I was an undergraduate, how did I get into IO? You didn't ask that question, but I'm going to tell it as a way of answering your question, Brandon. Um, I was an undergraduate psychology major, and I pretty much loved every course I took. I had phenomenal teachers, some of whom went on or even at the time were already world famous in their fields. And there was almost no aspect of psychology that didn't attract me. So as I approached my senior year in college and had to choose what to do, I said, okay, so I want to go to graduate school in psychology, but what field of psychology? So to be truthful, social psychology seemed the most interesting. I grew up in uh, a very well. This is a tough era, also, but uh, a era that boiled over with change. Late '60s, '70s, uh, change, disruption, revolution. You know, uh, so all there was almost no aspect of social psychology I didn't love and think was really important, really important. Everything from leadership to attitudes to prejudice to groupthink to all of those topics were all interesting. But on the other hand, I knew, and this is relevant to your question, I knew that if I went into social psychology, I would have one career option, and that was to be an academic. And I always felt that I was interested in all of psychology. And when I discovered IO, it gave me the opportunity to not have to give up anything. I didn't have to give up a need to really be a good social psychologist, a really good personality psychologist, be decent at statistics, be a good psychometrician. I needed to, have cognitive psychology and intelligence. Uh, so I didn't have to give any of that up. And the more I could develop skill and knowledge in those areas, the more it would inform my career as an IO psychologist. So my advice is, if you're passionate about psychology as broadly construed, not narrowly, you're going to become a great IO psychologist because you're just going to have more of a toolkit. You're going to see connections that people who are narrower are not going to see. And then the only way you're going to not become obsolete, I'm afraid, is by keeping that passion to learn new science all the time. Uh, I work a lot with leaders, and there's a lot of talk, of course, about learning agility. Just last year, I had a chapter in Veronica Schmidt Harvey's book on learning agility, the SIOP book. But since I wrote that chapter, there's uh, another factor that I didn't take into account that's really important, and it's really important for young professionals. Learning agility is your capacity to look around and learn from a variety of sources, to have mastered something, but then be okay giving it up and trying to master something else. But there's something else before that, and that is the passion, the motivation, the curiosity to apply your learning agility. So, learning agility is a skill, but what precedes it is preference, interest, motivation uh, to learn, intent to learn. You need that first. Uh, there's some recent research that I talk a lot about. I, that was one piece of research, a body of research I discovered last Christmas vacation, uh, was about the fact that so many organizations invest in sending people to learn leadership development when they're not so interested. They're either overwhelmed by their current job, or they have distractions at home, or they just feel very complacent about doing a great job with what they already know. Well, then these organizations are wasting thousands and collectively millions of dollars putting people to school, if you will, when they're really not all that interested in learning. So I think that is the primary skill that new professionals need to have. They need to be really curious about our field, broadly construed, learn and upskill themselves all the time. When undergraduates call me and they say, I want to be an IO psychology, I don't know exactly a psychologist, I don't know exactly what it means, but what kind of internship should I take? I tell them any internship, first choice in an HR department, anything, filling out forms all day, whatever. And second choice, any internship, not in HR, but in any large corporate environment. You're going to learn about culture. You're going to learn about power hierarchies. You're going to learn about so much just being in a large organization, and for as part of an internship, even if it has nothing to do with HR. Um, and so that's my advice for neophytes.
No, it's wonderful. And before I get to my point, I definitely agree about working for a large corporation because you get exposed to so many different things and so many different people and industries, or like sections in that industry. So I definitely agree on that. But I wanted to pick apart your beginning point about how I was psychology and how you had to master all these different facets. When it was you had to learn more about cognitive psychology and then research and data analysis, and you kind of pull together these a variety of skills that led you to like excel in this IO psychology field. And I feel like that's a great tip in itself because Brandon, I feel like we always talk about on this podcast the it's you're not siloed into one certain thing, but the best thing about IO psychology is everything that it has to offer.
I always tell my students, and they laugh, but I don't mean it as funny. I really see myself that way. I'm a mile wide and an inch deep. You people go for there. I have friends who are in the humanities, and they're scholars, real scholars. Like I, in my whole life, will never ever touch them. I have a friend who's a world renowned scholar in his field. He has an appendix to one of the books that he wrote that's 50 pages on a word, a single word, and how over the centuries that word has been used, applied, defined. I could, I could never sit in archives and libraries and going through manuscripts for 5 years to write a 50-page appendix on a word. That's just, God bless him. He's wonderful, and he is world class. He's in the, you know, he's in the books. They've written. There's a biography of him, but I just could never do that. So that you're right, Joe. The breadth of our field for me has always been a big attraction, even though I'm not. You use the term master. I've never mastered any of those areas compared to somebody who is a specialist in those areas.
100%. It's such a true conversation, and I think that it's an important conversation too because you don't get siloed like Joe said, and you're able to kind of have conversations maybe outside of your normal area of expertise in IO still. So like that's one of the things that makes psyop so great. When you get a bunch of IOs together, they might be doing all different things, but they can speak the same language, and that's like a really awesome thing that Joe and I have learned over the last 2 years since we started and finished our program is that you can go into these circumstances or environments, and if you speak that language but also learn how to speak the business language, it all works together. And I think that's kind of what we've been talking about a lot of this episode is like navigating that gap of the scientist practitioner gap, and then also like how can you learn and grow. So I think this is kind of a culmination of everything we've spoken about today. But we do want to appreciate you for coming on here. We've Your name has been mentioned on our podcast many times. Like even most recently in Dr. Janice Ward's episode, she mentioned working with you. So I'm really happy that we were able to make this happen.
Her, I'm proud to be have been her doctoral advisor.
Oh, she was wonderful.
She
Yeah.
was wonderful.
She is wonderful. There too, the other thing, IO folks are just great folks. They really are. You're going to discover as you move through your career. I mean, Janice and I is a great example. She was both a doctoral student of mine and also consulted for our firm. We've leave aside the teacher student relationship. We've been colleagues for 30 years. We have a famous picture in Seoul, Korea, of the two of us,
Wow.
taken in 1995.
Yeah. It's
Wow.
the community of IO. It
That's
really,
great.
it's
Yeah.
one of the reasons that
Really is,
people should do
really is.
IO, of the many reasons.
Of the many. If we could
I'm
end
a,
it
I'm a poster child for no question about it.
there.
But yeah, thank you
Most
again,
definitely.
Dr. Adler, for coming on. It's 40 minutes too short, but I think people are going to enjoy it. It was a fun time.
Thank you, thank you for inviting me, and never hesitate to invite me back again. I'll think of other things to talk about.
Works for us.
All right, take care. Thank you. Thanks all.
Take care. That was an awesome episode, Joe. I know we said it at the end there, but we've been trying to get him on for quite some time. So to have Dr. Adler appear on the episode and not just as a name, I'm really stoked that we were able to do that.
Yeah, I totally forgot actually until like this very moment that I remember the PSYOP in Boston. So our first PSYOP last year, one of my previous bosses told me, he's like, you got to go see Seymour Adler talk at PSYOP. And then I just like knew the name, but I was like, I didn't really know who he was at the point or what he's done for the field. So now to see him come on our podcast and talk about his journey in IO, it's kind of like it's full circle. It was great.
Yeah, and I love the topic of navigating the scientist practitioner gap. We have that conversation on here a lot, but I feel like people in consulting specifically like live that lifestyle in IO more than a lot of us, because they are constantly like the person of communication with clients and trying to use their IO knowledge on a daily basis. So for us to kind of get more of like a deep dive into that, I feel like was a really cool episode.
Yeah. You guys hope you guys liked it. I'm already thinking of the poll to put on the LinkedIn. So, but I want you guys to listen to the episode first and then respond to the poll, and we'll have some good conversation. So, as always, thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next time.
See you guys.